All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Friday webinar. My name is Missy Good, and I'm the mariculture specialist with Alaska Sea Grant. We are very pleased to have Bob Rowe here with the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association to talk to us about Vibrio and cold chain supply. We are recording this video, as you heard when you joined on. We are going to post the recording to our website after this. That'll be at the Alaska Sea Grant event page, and I'll put a link to that in the chat. Bob is open to questions throughout the presentation, so feel free when you do have a question to unmute yourself and ask that out loud. I'm also going to be monitoring the chat box as well. So if you do have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat box. If it seems like something that we should discuss right away, we can do that. Otherwise, I'll probably hold the written questions until the end of the presentation. Our presentation is going to be about an hour. You are probably not new to Zoom because we've been using Zoom quite a bit for the last couple of years. But if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see your audio icon and your video icon. Please make sure your audio icon is off during the presentation unless you are unmuting to ask a question. You'll also see on the bottom the little chat icon. It says chat on it. You can click on that, and if you type in a question, that's going to go to everybody, and then I can read it out loud at the end if that's your preference. Or if you would like to ask a question anonymously, go ahead and do that drop down and select my name, and I will ask it out loud anonymously for you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bob.
Happy Friday, everyone. It's beer 30 over here in Rhode Island on the East Coast. Happy to present to you something that I've presented many, many times on the East Coast, probably 20 times in 10 different states. I call it my scare talk, and it's a scare talk because I'm trying to scare you into doing the right thing so you don't have illnesses related to Vibrio, because it's a market killer and also guaranteed to spawn new ugly regulations. So I started my career a long time ago. Last time I was in Alaska was 1969, headed to Okinawa with my father, who was commander of the Green Berets in Vietnam, and I was a very young man. But anyway, I became an oyster farmer, worked on oysters while I was getting my PhD, which is not advisable to start a farm while you're trying to get your PhD. And then after 25 years growing oysters, blew my back out and decided I needed a desk job. So now I represent the East Coast growers. I'm Margaret Polaro of the East. And we work together very closely in DC, trying to keep the regulators from putting us all out of business. So, and now I'm not able to move my, oh, there we go. So why are regulations so hard? Well, let's go back to the previous century when we invented the flush toilet. And it was before people really understood that bacteria caused disease. They were holding oysters in the East River of Manhattan, where they were simultaneously dumping metric tons of horse manure. And they thought that disease was caused by bad air or miasma. And then they discovered that bacteria causes disease, developed the Koch's principles, showed that disease could be transmitted by bacteria. And they learned that the bacteria were killing people. The oysters in the bacteria in the oysters that they were eating were killing people. And the market evaporated, the price collapsed, the industry collapsed. And interestingly, we are just now getting back to the inflation adjusted price that oysters had in 1900, before people knew that the oysters were killing them. Soon we developed, it wasn't called the FDA and it wasn't called the ISSC, but the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference became the body that was regulating shellfish harvest. And we developed uniform regulations for the states, with the FDA auditing each of the states to ensure compliance with these uniform regulations. Because they early on they found out that if you don't have uniform regulations, some states are going to take shortcuts, and people will still be getting sick and the market will not recover. Thankfully, people are now seeing that we can eat oysters with confidence, that it's not going to end up killing you or having a bad night circling the drain. So we have biannual conferences of the ISSC where we get to argue with the FDA for an exciting 5 days. I encourage you to get involved in this very important process. Um, so why are we here? Well, you can thank me that we have to have we have to teach our growers what the rules are. That didn't used to be a mandate of the NSSP, but I pushed it through. I felt if you were going to be regulating me and finding me, you should at least be telling me what the rules are. So I forced through the NSSP the addition of the rules that every state must train their harvesters what the rules are, and they must have a refresher course every 2 years. So I'm the guy that gives these refresher courses for my state, Rhode Island. This is the outline of what I'm going to be talking about today, the overview of the regs, the Vibrio concerns, some state-specific regs, and then I'm going to throw in a little bit about working in the commons and aquaculture-specific issues if we have time at the end. So the general harvest regulations, permits, licenses, general requirements, tagging, seed and birds are what I'm going to be covering. So obviously, we have a harvester license or a dealer's license. If you are a harvester, you must sell to a licensed dealer. You cannot sell to individuals or restaurants, but if you want to have a dealer's license, it's typically more involved, requires typically a 3-day HACCP training class with extensive record keeping, and in most cases, a land-based facility, and that allows you to sell to restaurants and individuals. Some of the general requirements that are part of the NSSP, the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, that boats and shellfish containers must be clean. You can't have your shellfish in bilge water. Keep it away from fuel. Any waste or trash disposal in the waters of the U.S. is prohibited. Obviously, no sewage or vomit should go out into the waters. A porta potty is not required on the boat, but it is required in the NSSP that any harvest vessel must at least have a thunder bucket labeled with 3-inch high letters saying human waste. And even if you never use it, it's a good place to store your flares, things that need to be kept dry. And be aware that if you vomit overboard and you happen to have norovirus, you can contaminate hundreds of acres of growing area and end up sickening hundreds of people. This has happened, and it's like a terrorist event. So if you see somebody puking overboard, it's worth going and asking them, is everybody in your family puking, or did you just get drunk, or are you seasick? Because if they have norovirus, I'll be talking about norovirus. It's a great way to contaminate thousands of oysters. General requirements with tagging, well, there's a harvester tag on the bottom there and a dealer tag. If you have shellfish in your boat without tags on it, it's a critical violation. Your authorities can confiscate your crop. You must indicate that in most states, you must indicate during the Vibrio season. In other words, there is a typically, and I understand that your state is quite a bit different from every other state that I've worked with. You haven't had a lot of Vibrio illnesses. You may not have a defined Vibrio season like most of us do. But once you start to get a few illnesses, all that's probably going to change. So for those of us with a defined Vibrio season, you must indicate the start time, which is when the first shellfish breaks the surface of the water. And that has to be on the harvester tag. And of course, one for each container. It's got to be waterproof Tyvek, and you can pre-print these tags often with your lease number and your harvest area, save a little bit of scribbling out there on the water. And we did get bulk tagging put through as an option, especially for shellfish farmers, because we're always harvesting from the same spot. So all you have to do is put the harvest time and date and quantity on the tag. Saves you a bunch of challenges there. Just one note about traceability. The Food Safety Marketing Improvement Act was pushed through, and Rule 204 mandates the tracking of key data elements such as lot codes, harvest dates, shipment quantities, temperatures, etc. But shellfish were exempted because they said that we're already doing a pretty good job with traceability. However, the fact of the matter is that if you want to sell to a big dealer, that big dealer is going to have all of his other stuff meet this Rule 204. So it's probably going to say that you're going to have to do this anyway. So you might want to comply with the Rule 204 rules. And the easiest way to do that is consider using a blue trace tag printer. It meets all the requirements of Rule 204 in terms of lot codes. And the cool thing about it is if there ever is a recall, you can do it with a couple pushes of a button. Just something to consider. If you're just selling to local restaurants, you probably don't need to think about it. Um, Harvest area maps. Here again, every other state except Alaska has maps that delineate harvest areas and identify approved versus prohibited areas and those areas that are impacted by harmful algal blooms. This is a real challenge up in Alaska because you guys are so spread out and it's really hard for the authorities to go out and do the proper sampling. I understand most of you are involved in sampling your own growing waters on a regular basis, which is great. But it's really challenging to track harmful algal blooms, and you guys do have occasional harmful algal blooms. We have a great record in the NSSP of not having had a commercial shellfish implicated in a illness or death in the 60 years since we've been looking at this. Um, we would love to keep that record intact. We do have a lot of people, typically recreational harvesters, who don't like to look at the newspaper and don't read that there's a harmful algal bloom, and they go out and harvest some mussels or clams and they end up in the hospital. And that's terrible. But the problem is that the newspaper says shellfish, killed somebody or shellfish made somebody sick. And it's really bad for markets. What it really should say is idiot didn't read the newspaper, but that never happens. The regulations insist that shellfish must be free of mud and sediment. This is food. It's going in somebody's mouth. It doesn't take much effort to wash it off before you send it out. And it'll save your restaurants a lot of time. And they'll look at the product coming out of the box or out of the bag and they'll say, oh my God, look at that. It's pearly white. It's clean. It's lovely. They will like your product more than if it's covered in sea squirts and gunk. Operational plans are a requirement of the NSSP for structures that may attract birds or mammals. If you guys are using floating gear, what we find is that birds like to sit on it, and every time they take off, they leave something behind. So that guano is obviously got some pathogens in it, and we've had a few illnesses, not a lot, but just enough to raise the ire of the FDA, and the FDA specialists are going around to the states and insisting that we have deterrents on floating gear to keep the birds off. If you look carefully on the floats on the right, there's a couple of strings up here. Let me see. You can see these strings. Those will keep most birds from sitting on the gear. It's cheap, it's easy. There are other gear that is more challenging to prevent the birds from landing on. We've got scare kites. It looks like an eagle flying around as long as the wind's blowing. There's a lot of different stuff on our website. We have a whole stuff on my ECSGA.org website that will describe the various tools that you can use to prevent birds from landing on your gear. And I highly recommend you do that because we have had a few illnesses. So the other thing is that bird aggregations landing on your gear can influence water quality and force area closures. We just had 60 acres in New Jersey shut down because there were too many birds. The guys actually had 80% of their floating gear had deterrents on it, but there were enough birds on the other 20% that it lowered, there was too much coliform in the water, and they had to shut down 60 acres, putting 5 firms out of business. And if you've spent your life or your last 5 or 10 years building a business, that's a real hard pill to swallow. So here's the CDC dashboard, and we're looking at foodborne illnesses associated with oysters for the last 12-year period from 2009 to 2021. And the etiological agent is Campylobacter, which is the most common source of foodborne illness in the US, usually associated with chicken or dairy. Usually somebody fails to clean the cutting board after they cut up the chicken and they make the salad and they land in the hospital with bloody diarrhea. But these are oyster outbreaks, and there have been 9 outbreaks and 74 illnesses over this 12-year period. So it's not a lot. It's certainly not as many as Vibrio, but the FDA is on the rampage and they don't want to see gear out there without deterrence on it. So this is my new living hell. I have a whole chapter of our website looking at bird issues, bird deterrence, bird publications. Um, take care of it before it's a problem. The operational plan should also talk about seed. If you use seed that is produced in other than approved water, in other words, this guy's got his upwellers in a marina, which is obviously prohibited harvest area, and his seed needs to be grown out in clean waters for I believe it's a 3-month cleansing period, and the seed needs to be out of the prohibited waters before it reaches your state's maximum seed size, and that's going to change based on the species and the waters it's grown in. And I don't know if you guys have any hatcheries that are growing seed in prohibited waters and whether your state authority has established a maximum seed size yet. But if that happens, it turns out marinas are a very convenient place to grow seed. You got power, you got clean water, you got security. Typically, they're a little bit sheltered from the storm. So a lot of growers on the East Coast are growing seed in marinas. If you're buying seed from a grower that's doing the nursery work in prohibited waters, you'll need to provide records demonstrating that you are able to segregate that from the rest of your crop and ensure that the seed are purged for it's 3 or 4 months. I think we got it down to 3 months. That could be, when we started, I got this down to 1 year, then 6 months, then 4 months, and I think I've gotten it down to 3 months now. I've been working on getting it down to 2 months, but it may be a bridge too far for the FDA. If production methods don't allow you to segregate your crops, in other words, the crop that needs to be purged from the rest of your crops, then you should just buy seed from sources that are open, in open waters. So if nobody has any questions on the first part, I'll move to the main thing here, which is the Vibrio concerns. I understand you guys haven't had a lot of Vibrio concerns, so this is good. You don't want Vibrio concerns. Illnesses kill markets. So Vibrios, they are a naturally occurring bacteria. Most of them are not associated with sewage or pollution. They are ubiquitous in warm waters. We got many, many species and hundreds of strains. One of the species is Vibrio vulnificus, which you don't have yet. Vibrio parahemolyticus is one that you're probably familiar with, and it's all related to Vibrio cholera. There's a Vibrio that kills fish in fish hatcheries. There's a Vibrio that kills shellfish larvae in shellfish hatcheries. There's Vibrio alginolyticus, which is responsible for a lot of wounds on fishermen when you get spiked by either the fin of a fish or a fish hook. One of my employees had his thumb swell up the size of a pear and split open because of alginolyticus. Vibrios are nasty, but not all of them are, but there's quite a few of them are. And one of the things is they have a flagella, they're motile. Another thing is they have an organ called the peri, which allows them to exchange DNA, which is not usual. Most bacteria divide, and the clones are genetically indistinguishable from their parent. But through this peri, they're able to exchange a little DNA, and that allows them to evolve a lot faster, which means they are really advanced in the bacterial world, which is why we have so many species and so many strains and serotypes. So Vibrio vulnificus, you guys don't have this yet. Very rare, usually in the Gulf, only very warm water, only, it's really only serious for immunocompromised individuals. And by that, I mean somebody with liver failure, diabetes, they're on immunosuppressant drugs. Maybe they had a transplant or cancer or AIDS, and they're on drugs that are suppressing their immune system. For those individuals, it is 20% fatality. And these, when somebody dies from eating an oyster, it's really bad for markets, honestly. If somebody dies on the Gulf from eating an oyster, the price of lobster in Maine crashes. The consumer's not that savvy. We have had a spike in Vibrio vulnificus illnesses in Florida after the hurricane because all these older people with liver failure were wading around in low salinity waters and bumping into something and cutting themselves. So there was a spike of about 35 VV illnesses down there. We had a Vibrio vulnificus wound infection mortality in Rhode Island. And the problem when that happens is that the press goes to town with, if you Google Vibrio vulnificus, you'll see that these are typically gruesome illnesses with skin blistering off, causing amputations. And so the press goes to town with flesh-eating bacteria articles that absolutely destroys shellfish markets. Because even though it was a wound infection and had nothing to do with oyster consumption, they feel compelled to have a picture of oysters on the article, and it's just devastating. So be happy you don't have this. It's rare, but when it happens, it's devastating. So what about VP? Well, the FDA has records of proven illnesses tracked about 2,300 a year. And from that, they project 80,000 because they assume that a certain number of people are not reporting it or that it's not being detected or not being verified in the hospital. Turns out Vibrios are kind of challenging to grow in a petri dish to confirm that that was actually what got the person sick. Vibrio parahemolyticus, unlike vulnificus, loves high salinity waters and it loves warm waters like all Vibrios do. There are lots of wound infections as well as consumption infections. And Vibrio parahemolyticus, it, it thrives on chitin. So it eats dead crabs and dead shrimp and dead copepods and anything with a chitinous exoskeleton. So if you are trapping crabs and killing crabs, it's a good idea not to put it near your lease because you might be just breeding more VP around your lease. Again, VP is typically self-limiting and just causes a bad night, maybe a couple of bad nights, gastroenteritis, diarrhea, vomiting. And if you are a healthy individual, that's going to be self-limiting. But if you are immunocompromised, it does have about 1% mortality. So it can be serious, as most illnesses can be more serious for those individuals. If you are immunocompromised or you know somebody's bellying up to the raw bar and you see that they're clearly an alcoholic and their liver is probably shot, you might suggest that they have cooked oysters instead of raw, especially in the middle of summer. For that matter, they should probably not be eating too much raw salad either. So Vibrio parahemolyticus, one of the crazy things about this particular strain, Vibrio, it has one of the fastest growth doubling times on the planet of almost any bacteria. When it gets up over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, it can double every 15 minutes. And if you've ever played backgammon with a doubling cube, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, suddenly you're 64. So you can take very safe shellfish and turn it into a ticking time bomb by leaving it out in the sun. But the one tool that we have in the box is to keep it cold. It doesn't grow below 50 degrees at all. In fact, it's called viable but non-culturable. So they can't even grow it when the water temperatures are below 50 and they can barely detect it. Prompt refrigeration is the most effective tool in the box, but we know from FDA studies that temperature abuse in our supply chain is still a problem. Well, how do we know that? Because the FDA went out and they got a lot of oysters right out of the water, and then they went and they looked at what was available in the stores or in the restaurants, and there was about 10 to 100 times more Vibrio parahemolyticus in the shellfish at retail than there was coming out of the water. So somebody's not doing their job and keeping the shellfish down below 50 degrees. And it is still a challenge in the few cases where it's coming out of the water hot. In other words, we've got growers There's one very challenging area, Katama Bay on Martha's Vineyard. For some reason, every year, I know these growers are doing the right thing. They take the oysters out of the water, they plunge them into an ice bath right away. They get them down below 50 degrees and then they send them off to be eaten. And they still get 7 illnesses a year. So there are cases where they're coming out of the water with enough of a load. It takes somewhere between 30,000 and 3,000 cells to cause an illness. Um, what about other shellfish? So why are the regulations different for clams or mussels? Well, what do we know about VP and oysters? Well, obviously oysters are filter feeders and they concentrate the VP just like a clam or a mussel would. Um, can we depurate VP? Yes, we can. It seems to take a little bit longer than, say, depurating the other bacteria that we know about. It seems to form some kind of a ligand with the shellfish tissue. So it typically takes 4 or 5 days to decrease VP by 2 logs, which is what we try and do when we're trying to make shellfish safe. Um, it's very hard to sample for VP, but it's ubiquitous. It's out there. It's everywhere. But there's only a few strains of VP that are actual pathogens. So you can go out there and you can sample for the genes that are associated with illness. TRH and TDH positive are typically the two genes that are associated with pathogenic strains. But there are also illnesses associated with VP that are TRH and TDH negative. So that's not necessarily clear. We can go out and sample for the specific serotype that's causing illnesses. That would be better, but it's hard to do that. And with the hundreds of samples that we've taken of oysters around the East Coast, looking for this one strain that's responsible for more than 85% of our illnesses, we've only detected it twice. So it's not like we have the ability to go out there and be proactive. The other thing that's really challenging is that the variability is vast. So you can sample two oysters in the same bag from the same farm, and one will have 100 times more VP in it than the one that's right next to it. So we don't really know what's going on there, but we do know that when you're doing experiments, you need to have a lot of samples because your variability is going to be very challenging to make any statistical um, sample be meaningful. Canada has instituted a policy requiring that total Vibrio, in other words, all VP, be less than 100 per gram. It seems to work in Washington and British Columbia that when they can keep those numbers down below 100 per gram, it seems to cut it down on illnesses dramatically. But on the East Coast, we have a very poor correlation between total Vibrio parahemolyticus and pathogenic Vibrio parahemolyticus. So what does that mean? It means that we can have a very high total and not have illnesses, or sometimes we can have a low total VP and still have illnesses. So what we find is that on the east coast of Canada, they're shutting down growing areas because the harvest numbers are high in summer coming out of Atlantic Canada, and they still don't have illnesses. In fact, as far as I know, they've never had an illness. So they're shutting down growing areas that doesn't appear to be justified. And we find that since this correlation between total and pathogenic VP is so random on the East Coast, we do not seem to think that total Vibrio is actually indicative of anything for us. So the doubling time. So this is a difficult chart to explain, but what it tells you is that the time to double is inversely related to the temperature. You get very hot, your doubling time drops dramatically. Here's another way to look at it, that if you were to take an oyster or a petri dish and it had 8 colonies and you held it for 6 hours, well, at 90 degrees, those 8 colonies would be 512 colonies. This is when we start to really worry about it. If it's coming out of the water and it's 80 degrees Fahrenheit and you can get it down to 70, I don't really worry about 70 degrees shellfish that much, honestly, because it's a doubling time that's on the order of 13 hours. What I really worry about is leaving it out in the sun and having it go from 80 to 90. And now you're turning good food into a ticking time bomb. So this is what the main message is. It's the one tool in the box that we have. And just so you know, you guys probably have this strain of Vibrio parahemolyticus called O4K12, the outbreak strain. So just to let you know, in New England, we used to have very few VP illnesses, about 5 a year, called sporadic illnesses. Nobody really worried about it. Certainly wasn't in the news. And then, I was looking at the counts that coming out of Washington State, and I used to think these guys were giant because they would have 200 or 300 illnesses a year. I'm like, what are they doing? They must be leaving the VP out in the sun, leaving the oysters out and baking them in the sun. And then in 2012, we had this wonderful strain introduced to New England waters. And suddenly we were getting 30 illnesses a year in Connecticut and 30 illnesses a year in Massachusetts. And it was, we had to change our entire industry. We went from 10 hours to refrigeration to 4 and then 2 hours to refrigeration. And a lot of us are doing what we call instant refrigeration. This particular strain is 100 times more virulent than any of the other strains of VP that we've worked with. And it's now responsible for more than 85% of the illnesses we have in New England. So it was a huge game changer. We had bad press, lots of illnesses. We had closures and recalls, and of course, massive amounts of new regulations were slammed down our throat. And of course, the tendency for others, blame others. Well, we're not doing anything different. My growers were all like very, it can't be my fault. It must be the trucker or the restaurant. Somebody downstream is abusing the shellfish. And then it wasn't until about 2 or 3 years of having these 30 illnesses a year that they realized that it wasn't that we were doing anything. It was this new strain. And you have this. You have this. This was the strain that sickened a boat full of tourists up in Alaska a long time ago. It's now spread to New England. It's in Europe. It's in a lot of areas of Asia. It's certainly in Washington State and Oregon. And it should scare the hell out of you. So I get this question a lot. Why are we seeing illnesses increasing? Certainly we see with climate change, we're getting warmer waters and warmer air temperatures. I don't think I need to tell you guys that. You're seeing it. If you're on the water, you know it. We're certainly seeing more oysters being eaten in summer. It used to be that people only ate oysters in months with an R. Now we're seeing a lot more oysters being eaten and a lot more oysters being eaten in summer. We certainly have better reporting and better surveillance. The hospitals are obligated to report anytime somebody goes to the hospital and gets diagnosed with a Vibrio illness. There's a whole COVID reporting scheme, and there's better tools in the hospitals. There's basically it's a PCR where if you present in the hospital with severe diarrhea, they put in a sample into the machine and they'll tell you which of the most 12 most common illnesses you have in a matter of 24 hours. And the hospitals love it because it's like a money printing machine that costs them $25 a sample and they can charge you 250. So, and then people are less tolerant of foodborne illness in our society today. It used to be that a lot of people, and you go to France and people are like, oh, I got sick from eating the shellfish. Oh, who cares? But Americans, no, we go to the hospital and we're like, yeah, well, I need a drug, make me better. So we also have more susceptible consumers. We have a lot more people who are older. They have failing livers. They've got diabetes. They've got immunosuppression drugs, something like that. One of the things that we find is that Prilosec and Nexium the use of this is just skyrocketing. It's for the gastric reflux, and it knocks down the acidity of your stomach, which is your first line of defense. There's a reason why your dog can go out and eat a dead seagull and not get sick, is because dogs have very acidic stomachs. Well, after thousands of years of cooking our food, humans have less acidic stomachs, and now we've got Prilosec and Nexium to make our stomachs even less acidic. I've got a friend who had to basically stop eating salads because she was on Nexium and Prilosec, and she kept getting foodborne illnesses. But the main reason why we are seeing more VP illnesses, I'm convinced, is this new strain. It has really been a game changer, certainly in New England, with the higher attack rate. So does VP correlate with temperature? Well, I mean, in a broad sense, it does. Yes, in cold waters, you won't see it. In warm waters, it obviously is much happier. And certainly, in Alaska, these temperature triggers that you guys are working with seems to be working well. Puget Sound growers have adopted a temperature trigger for enhanced Vibrio. In some cases, some of the growers stop harvesting when they get to a certain temperature, and it seems to be working reasonably well. But on the East Coast, we don't seem to have it that simple. So, for instance, in Rhode Island, in my state, we grow half of our 10 million oysters in very warm coastal tidal ponds, bathwater. And yet, less than half of our illnesses come from those waters. More than half of our illnesses come from the bay, which is at least 4 or 5 degrees cooler. It's possible that the growers in the ponds are more conscientious about icing. But when we go out and we just sample for TRH and TDH, those levels are higher in the bay than they are in these warm coastal ponds, which goes against everything we thought we knew about Vibrio. That's very challenging. And then, look, Virginia has fewer cases than Massachusetts. You would think Virginia is warmer than Massachusetts. Yes, it is. But here again, it's the 04K12 strain that we have that they don't. So it's a game changer. You don't want it. I think you have it. Be aware that, the risk of illness is between 10 to 100 times more than for most. So you guys are regulating when your water and air temps go up. That is wrong. But I just want to go through a brief history of the FDA's approach to Vibrio management. The ISSC, we joke that it has become the Vibrio conference because suddenly, pretty much the FDA has really been focusing on Vibrios for really since 2005 and before then. The FDA came to the ISSC conference in New Hampshire in 2005, said, we're going to force you guys to basically cook everything. You're either going to high pressure process it or cook it or pasteurize it or gamma irradiate it because everybody loves irradiated oysters. And this was all to kill Vibrios. We, the industry, went back to Congress and we said, we need to defeat this proposal because basically, if it were to have happened, China would be eating our lunch because they can produce an oyster for 15 to 25 cents. And sure, it's been grown in human filth, but it really doesn't matter if it's cooked. So if we have to cook our oysters, we're competing directly with China, who can produce an oyster at a third of the price. So anyway, we're very proud of the fact that we have our association and the PCSJ working to protect your right to sell a raw oyster, and we have great ties in DC. So, but it didn't mean that we had to stop doing anything. We still had to work hard to stop getting people sick. So we've really adopted a very aggressive education plan. I have become what I call the Vibrio evangelist, and I go around and I try and scare people into doing the right thing, which is basically keeping your shellfish cold. But it's the entire supply chain. We've got all kinds of information that we hand out. And of course, I go around and give this talk as many times as I can. And we try and prevent immunocompromised people from eating any raw food, but especially oysters in summer. And we rely on the industry to apply peer pressure. If you see somebody doing the wrong thing and they're leaving shellfish out on deck in the sun, or worse yet, in the back of a pickup truck under a blue tarp, which is like a pressure cooker, you should probably be dropping a dime because they're going to get somebody sick. And when enough people get sick, they're going to close your growing area. And then you won't be selling oysters for a few months. So we've got all kinds of brochures out there that you can download, or I could mail you cases. I've got cases in my garage. We've got ones for harvesters. We've got ones for truckers and transporters. Basically tell them, keep the damn refrigerator on in your truck, you dumbass. And then, we've got ones for consumers and recreational harvesters, because honestly, I've got idiots in Rhode Island who drive around in August with shellfish in their trunk, and they invariably get themselves sick. And again, the press says shellfish got somebody sick, not idiot drove around with shellfish in their trunk for 3 hours. So your regs in Alaska, what are your regs? Well, um, you've got a unique approach. Honestly, you are forced to sink your gear in response to specific water temperatures. Now, this is not something that is written up in the NSSP. I was kind of shocked to learn this, but as long as you don't have illnesses, it seems to be working. So I encourage you to continue to avoid illnesses. And that might involve icing, it might involve refrigeration, because as soon as you start getting some illnesses, things are going to change. You're going to be forced to adopt a Vibrio management plan. And what are the various Vibrio management plans? Well, as I mentioned, it's shade, it's keeping your product cold, it's either going out with ice, or if it's bad enough and you start getting enough illnesses, they're going to shut you down in summer. So it's basically, don't let your product warm up. So if you can get it down to 70, that's great. If you can get it down to 50, that's even better. Um, Occasionally, we are seeing some illnesses, even when we splash them in an ice slurry. So this is an experiment that was done. And we put some temperature tags inside an oyster that was shucked, and then put a rubber band over it to see how fast we could take an oyster down from 88 degrees. And we splash it in an ice slurry that's at about 40, 35, 40 degrees. We've learned that 40 degrees is really the optimal temperature. If you splash them, you can make ice cream if you put ice in seawater. So you don't want to have it too cold, because you can shock the oyster and it can abuse the shelf life. But here we show how we can get it down in less than 10 minutes to below 50, which is really the target where oyster growth is completely stopped. And then take it out after 10 minutes. You get a nice cold rock, put it in a cooler. You only need a handful of ice to keep it cool after that. That is the gold standard. If you really want to do the best thing possible, that it's not hard, it's not challenging. You're pulling oysters out. You just throw them in the ice slurry for about 8-10 minutes. Good to go. Layered ice on your shellfish works almost as well at bringing them down if they're really that hot. I can't imagine that your oysters are coming out of the water at 80 degrees, but you know better. Take a thermometer out there with you. One thing you should know is that a reefer truck is not designed to cool product down. It is designed to keep cold product cold. So can't really count on most reefer trucks to bring it down. But if you do start to get illnesses, it's going to trigger Vibrio control plans that are mandated by the NSSP. In most states, shade is required on harvest vessels. You're going to reduce the time to temperature. In other words, the time under which that oysters are now under temperature control. They may force you to harvest for shucking or post-harvest processing only. This is pretty rare. And some of them may require harvest area closures. This is also very rare. You don't want to go there. Resubmergence. So one thing that we have found, and if you're using floating gear, if you're using these oyster grow cages, which are really magnificent in terms of managing the fouling on your gear, you flip them up for a day and roast off all the sea squirts and fouling on the cage. Well, the oysters, it's hard on the oysters. And of course, if they're warmed up in the sun, which is what you want to do to kill all the fouling, it takes them a while to get back to pumping. This is an animal, it's not a rock. And eventually, they'll start pumping again and then purge the Vibrios. Most of the studies that we've done show that it takes about 5 days for the oysters to return to a background level of Vibrio in their tissue. In most cases, the states require that you document this by tagging, which lines were flipped and how long they were resubmerged before you sell them. Now that is also part of the Vibrio management plan control measures that are required in the NSSP if you are using desiccation. If they're just being desiccated intertidally, during a tidal cycle, they seem to go back. The Vibrio levels in the oysters miraculously fall back to background by the next tide. So that doesn't seem to be a problem. But if they're out for a full day to kill the fouling, that seems to be a whole different kettle of fish. So keep it cool. There's a lot of strategies that we've developed. You can leave it in the water till the last minute. certainly shade on the boat and in the truck, but there's got to be an airspace under that shade. Otherwise, it's a pressure cooker. Ice, get it to the dealer fast. A lot of us have requirements where we try and get it to the dealer before 10 in the morning, or try and get it with, less than 2 hours out of the water. So the southern states that don't have this aggressive O4K12 virulent strain, they seem to think 5 hours to refrigeration is working for them. So if you're not getting illnesses, what you're doing is working. As soon as you start to get illnesses, you need to be doing something else. But you should also talk to your dealer and your trucker and make sure they're doing the right thing. If you're delivering to a restaurant and they're leaving it out on the floor of the restaurant for overnight or for a few hours, that's going to cause Vibrio levels to go up. So I always walk it walk it right into the walk-in for them, and make sure they always tell you, oh yeah, put it on the floor in there. Well, make sure there's no raw meat above it, because if there's raw chicken or raw meat dripping down on it, somebody's going to get sick, and guess what? They're going to blame the oyster. So it's illegal for the restaurant to have your product under raw meat in the walk-in cooler, but most restaurants are not really following the regulations very well. So you can be creative. What's working for you? Spray it with cool water, get it down a few degrees. Certainly shade is great. Coolers are great. Uh, 15 minutes here. I want to say a word about norovirus. This is so it's second only to Campylobacter as a foodborne illness cause in the US, incredibly highly contagious. Viruses are really good at spreading. It turns out that there's in 1 gram of vomitus or feces in an infected person, 1 gram, there's 3 to 7 billion with a B viral particles, and it only takes 10 to get you sick. Thankfully, norovirus is not a huge problem in US shellfish because our sewage treatment works pretty well. But around the world, I wouldn't be eating raw shellfish in China, honestly. And certainly we read about norovirus in Europe a lot. So there's something they're doing with their sewage that's a little bit different than we are. But typically when we have a problem with norovirus, it's because somebody pukes overboard or somebody's flushing their head in the growing area. If you see something, say something. It's a terrorist event if they're spreading norovirus into your harvest area, honestly. Please support your research partners. We have so many problems that we need to work on, lots of challenges and unanswered questions. So if you've got somebody in your state that wants to do research on your farm, just say yes, work with them. They need your help. They can't do it alone. We need better tools to monitor these pathogens so that we can avoid illnesses. Just because I have you here, I'm going to say a few words about working in the commons. We have had some bad actors in our industry in the southern states, and it's getting really hard to get a lease. So your actions reflect on everyone. You don't own your lease, it's a privilege. And if you make enemies, it's going to make us all look bad. If you get somebody sick or cause a closure, everybody in your area is going to hate you. And so stay on your lease, work within your permit, don't break the law, don't throw trash in the watershed. And if your lease looks like this, you're doing a bad job. Your lease should be nice and neat and tidy. Otherwise, you're giving the entire industry a black eye. If there's marine debris coming off of your lease and washing up on the beaches, you're giving the industry a black eye. Please do beach cleanups. Please don't make a mess. Please give our industry a good reputation so that the next guy can get a lease next to you. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to expand when you want to go get a bigger lease, or the next guy is going to try and get a lease and everybody's going to scream at him. So we've got a best management practices module on my website. I highly encourage you to go there. It won't take you very long to make a customized farm plan. It's a great marketing material. We've identified all the key do's and don'ts. It's like how to anchor so things don't blow away. It doesn't take very long, and it does allow you to generate a nice little PDF that you can use. It's good for permitting. It's good for marketing. Join your state association. Join your regional association. They're really working hard for you, and they need your support. It's expensive work that we do, going to DC and fighting with the FDA all the time. And if you see somebody doing something wrong that's going to cause an illness or reflect badly on the industry, think about what you're going to do. Obviously, it would be smart to think about it before it's an emergency, rather than it's always uncomfortable and people tend to avoid conflict. But if an illness is traced to your growing area, you could face a closure and recall, even if it was caused by your neighbor. Um, just a few words about seed sources. Your oysters don't have as many diseases as we do, but seed imports should still be considered a risk. Seed imports, if you're importing them from away from your site, I encourage people to import really small seed and do your own upweller work. It's much less chance of bringing in an illness or an infection or a new pathogen into your waters if you're bringing in a 2 millimeter seed compared to something that's already an inch. Most states require pathology inspections. I don't know what your state regs are there. And I encourage everybody to order your seed early, put down a deposit, pay for your seed promptly, or you probably won't get your order filled next year because all the hatcheries talk to each other. It's probably wise to order from multiple hatcheries if you have that option in Alaska, because invariably somebody has a bad batch and suddenly there's nothing available to sell or buy. Consider triploids. They don't spawn in summer. You may not have that issue if you're submerging your animals below the thermocline. They might not spawn anyway, but everybody knows that an oyster, once it spawns out, it's pretty thin and watery and undesirable. You're going to have to wait for it to fatten back up before you can market it. Again, I talked about the seed from uncertified waters. Check out my website. We got a huge amount of information on there. One thing I really advise you to look at my rookie mistakes to avoid. Even if you're not a rookie anymore, there are mistakes that even experienced growers have made. Check it out. Save yourself a lot of money. I made a lot of stupid mistakes that you shouldn't want to repeat. As I said, support the PCSGA to keep your regulations workable. We are your voice in DC. We are your voice at the FDA, and we need your support. So how did I do on time? Did I get us done in an hour? Pretty much. Hopefully somebody's got questions. Hopefully I didn't put you all asleep.
Yeah, that was fantastic, Bob. Just a wealth of information. And I just want to get folks to take a look at that chat. Bobby and myself have been putting in a whole bunch of links to different resources that Bob has mentioned along the way. So right now, I want to open it up to questions. You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask out loud. Otherwise, you could type them into the chat box and that will automatically just go to everyone, or you could do that drop down that says to everyone, and you could select myself if you would like me to ask that question anonymously. I see a couple. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Carol Brady. I'm the shellfish program coordinator here in Alaska. And it's more of a comment than a question, Bob. I just wanted to let you know that Alaska does have a Vibrio control plan in place for Vibrio parahemolyticus. Our Vibrio season runs between June 15th through September 15th, and we do have other requirements. Like if temperatures reach a certain degree, they have the option of dropping their shellfish if they're in an area where they're able to do that. And there's also time from harvest to temperature controls and other things. And it looks like Bobby Hudson popped in the link for our control plan in the chat. But I'm also here to answer any questions about our control plan too. Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. Connor, I see that you're unmuted. If you'd like to ask your question. Perhaps you're not there. Angie, did you have a question?
I did not. I think that's one of my students, maybe.
One thing
if you're unmuted, feel free to ask.
Yeah, while we're waiting, I just wanted to say that I always considered myself to be a better marketer, salesman than I was a farmer. We've got a great marketing branded oysters video on my website. I highly recommend you take a look. Everything I know about marketing oysters is on there. Even if you're selling pottery or widgets or whatever, it's some great recommendations on marketing branded oysters and everything I know. Again, the website is a wealth of information about everything you want to know about oysters.
I'll ask a question quick.
Oh, sorry, I had a question real
Yeah,
quick.
go
Please.
for it.
Thank you. Hi, this is Kat from MAA, Bob. Good to see you.
Hi.
I was wondering, is there any work being done on testing waters and like genetic testing between the differences between the pathogenic Vibrio and the non-pathogenic and how that could be tied into regulations?
Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned, there's a lot of work being done using TRH and TDH, but it's not always a great correlation with the pathogens. We've got TRH, TDH negative strains that have caused illnesses, and certainly total is a lousy indicator for pathogenic. In New England, where we have the O4K12, or strain, I think it's 65 or something, I could be wrong. The serotype 65 or something. Anyway, this O4K12 strain that is causing 85% of our illnesses, we've been looking for it. Cheryl Whistler at UNH has done a lot of work, and we've looked and processed hundreds of samples of oysters and only found it twice. So it's like a needle in a haystack. And we would love to be proactive and say, oh, we've got it and we shouldn't process or we shouldn't be selling, but it's not that simple. And certainly for the rest of the country where they don't have the O4K12 and there's a host of probably 5 or 10 pathogenic strains in say Virginia, it's really hard to use PCR. I mean, you got to use PCR anyway to do TRH and TDH positive, but it's like looking for a needle in a haystack, honestly, because there are so many benign strains, and trying to find the hot tickets in that forest of benign strains is really a challenge.
Thank you. That makes sense, unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right,
We
Bob.
end up being in a reactive mode instead of a proactive mode. We kind of have to wait for the illness outbreak and then shut down the growing area, which is not great for markets or certainly public health, but there's little we can do.
A question from the chat. Bob, what research could most support the oyster industry in Alaska?
Well, so I am predicting that as your industry grows, and my perception is that it's growing rather rapidly or has the potential to, you're going to pretty soon swamp your local markets. And so that's going to mean that to keep your prices up, you're going to need to get the product out of Alaska to other markets. So my concern would be is that if you're going to have to air freight it to the lower 50 states, my experience is that doubles the price of the oyster. And suddenly my 70-cent oysters costing it's $140 a box, and that's pretty hard to sell. I have a few customers in California that'll do that, but it's certainly not enough to keep me going. So if you want to keep your price up, you're going to need to figure out how you can get your product to the lower 48 fast, but cheap. So we've got, typically wonderful trucking. I can get my stuff to Chicago in 48 hours in a refrigerated truck for about 20 cents a pound, which is incredibly cheap compared to air freight, which has to be in an air freight box and is expensive. But I would start to investigate other markets. Maybe it's Canada, maybe it's China, maybe it's, the Chinese are actually willing to pay a lot for American products because they know they aren't going to get sick. And if they eat a Chinese oyster, they're going to have a really bad night. So we're able to sell our oysters in China for about 3 times what a Chinese oyster sells for to the people who can afford it. And because there's a lot of people, and there's, I think they sell more Lamborghinis and Mercedes in China than anywhere. So there are some people who can afford it. Um, I I guess I would be looking at marketing and transportation and preservation methods. I suppose I worry about value added marketing. In other words, if you wanted to say do a frozen top on Rockefeller oyster, that's pretty popular with the cruise ships. But you're competing again against the Chinese who can do a top off Rockefeller oyster that's frozen, that's pre-cooked for a lot less. So um, what would I be looking at? I guess I would be, trying to figure out the best method to grow oysters in Alaska. We have a large, I call it adaptive radiation over the last, well, since really we invented plastics in the late 80s, there's been a proliferation of different growing methods. We've got flip farm, we've got the oyster grow cage, we've got it seems like every year there's a new cool way to grow oysters. The flip bags that are down in Washington State seem to produce a marvelous shaped oyster, which is really cool if you've got enough tide to do that. Um, I would be, trying to figure out the best way to limit your labor. Labor's killing farmers across the country. So how can you do this as cost effectively as possible um, with, what are the best tools that work in your environment?
Great. Another question from the chat. What type of PCR machine and method are you using for your monitoring?
So I'm an oyster farmer. I'm not that kind of PhD. I don't know.
So that's fair. The next one is a little bit easier. Did Rhode Island have any illnesses this last summer or any outbreaks?
We haven't, we had one outbreak last year. It was our first outbreak. I really hammered into it. Well, I was the first guy in Rhode Island, and most of the guys who started farms, worked for me, started their own farms. And I was a real prick about keeping oysters cold. So pretty much my industry was very good, and we didn't have any illnesses until just a few years ago. Then it started to I got 40 growers, and I don't know half of them anymore. And some of them are apparently cutting corners because we had 24 illnesses last year. Now that's still one illness per 70,000 servings. So I'm okay with, but I'm never really okay with illnesses. So we have changed our Vibrio management plan. We are a lot more rigid now about enforcement. We are a lot more careful. And we had that one outbreak, and that guy has gotten so much flack from the other growers in the state. He doesn't show himself around very much anymore because there's a lot of people who want to key his truck, shall we say.
All right, another question from the chat that I'm going to read. What are the studies done to bring holding time down from contaminated areas to cleaner areas before sale? 1 year to 6 months to 4 months, etc. And if that's not clear, Sarah, maybe you could unmute yourself and ask it.
Yeah, no, it's very clear, and I'll explain it. So the seed rules for growing seed in prohibited waters and then transporting them to your farm. Initially, it was based on studies that I did. I initially thought that well, I was told that if I wanted to grow oysters in Rhode Island, they would kill me. So I said, well, where can I grow oysters for my hatchery that nobody wants? And I started, well, how about under a dock in a marina? Nobody wants that water. So I put them all there and thought they were going to die immediately. There's all this oil and boat paint and everything else. Turned out it was the fastest growing spot in the state. I later got patents on a floating upweller design, and I had my oysters growing under the gas dock in a marina. And I had the fastest growing record of growth for the species reported in the literature. And I assumed that they were going to be full of all kinds of nasty stuff. So I did a lot of studies on heavy metals, never tripped the alert levels that the FDA had. They were high in iron. I had 1 milligram 1 part per thousand iron. But who cares? It's in my 1 a day. I had high zinc, which is good for you. I had high copper. Shocking. Copper bottom paint, zinc, shocking in a boat marina. Um, there was no polyaromatic hydrocarbons, even though I was growing them under the gas dock. Well, an upweller is drawing water from 2 feet of depth, and most of the aromatic hydrocarbons are floating on the surface. So I would see this sheen from all the boats that are in the marina, but they weren't picking it up in the seed. So I was able to go to the ISSC and say, look, this is a wonderful place to grow shellfish seed. It's protected. I've got electricity. I've got, security, lights, fresh water. And look, there's no evidence that they're picking up heavy metals. And so they said, okay, well, you can drop it to 6 months. And and then they said 4 months. And then we're looking at, well, if you've got a 1-inch oyster and it's increasing in biomass, probably 10-fold, 100-fold before it gets to market size, well, there's no risk of really any heavy metals, even though I never really got to a level of heavy metals that was of health concern. And then I always get calls when I'm giving a talk. So the next concern was, well, what about, certainly these waters are closed because somebody might be flushing their head in the marina. Well, pathogens tend to depurate in a matter of 48 hours or so. With the exception of norovirus, it can take 2 to 3 weeks. So how about we say 3 months? And I was like, well, how about 2 months? Because I don't want to be keeping all these records and trying to keep them, all separate from the rest of my crop. It's not that I want to sell something that's only been out of the upweller for 2 months, but I don't want to have to keep it separate and keep all the records and do all the record keeping. So I'm continuing to push the FDA, and they're continuing to say no. So we're stuck at 3 months. Even though, they are saying we've got a whole committee looking at this, and I'm like, well, what are your concerns? If there's a specific concern, a pollutant that you're worried about, I'm happy to do the experiment. And the FDA is dragging their feet and saying, well, we haven't really got it that. I can't tell you what we're worried about. Well, we're worried.
That's a really great example and a good example showing how you can get things changed. Another question we have in the chat, you mentioned protecting the right to sell a raw oyster versus cooked. What suggestions do you have to help market?
Well, I mean, don't get people sick is the best one. Have a high quality product. Watch my marketing video. It's everything about marketing is giving the customer what they want. They want to have a uniform, clean, safe, fresh product that tastes good, has the right shape, sits on the plate well, and they want to have it every week, delivered with a smile and good service. Everything that goes into marketing a brand is all spelled out in my Marketing Branded Oysters video.
Great. We have no more questions in the chat. James, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Bob. James Crimp. I'm also at Alaska Sea Grant. And I was chatting with a grower last week that I believe what he said was he used to ship out of state, and then kind of one of the factors that triggered him stopping was his Vibrio, or his oysters made it to a market, and maybe it was a specific restaurant where they kind of got combined with another pool of oysters from around the country, and somebody's oysters in that pool had Vibrio. So there was, I guess there was, somebody got sick from their oysters that day or that week or something like that, and it resulted in that restaurant not buying oysters from a lot of those growers. So I guess my question is there a way to sort of prove to that your oysters are staying cold from the time you pull them out of the water to the time they get to market? And how can you kind of avoid being lumped in with other oysters that might not have that same supply chain security?
Yeah, so I mean, there are certainly temperature trackers. One of the cool things that we've got, one of the advertisers in my newsletter, also on our website, is VitSab. They've got these cool little buttons, and it's got chemicals inside, and you just as you're about to put it on the truck to go out the door, you push the button, and it mixes the chemicals inside, and it starts a chemical reaction. The chemical reaction will turn the button from green to red as the time and temperature abuse occurs. So if you keep that button and the box with the oysters, it sticks to your tag or to your oyster box. If especially if you're doing, say, shipping FedEx to somebody, you want to have a way for the consumer to know that it's safe to eat what's inside. Well, if that tag arrives and it's still green, you know that that box has not been temperature abused, because the chemical reaction that would turn it red or yellow, it starts yellow. It's just perfect. It's like a stop sign, stoplight. And it's relatively affordable. I forget what the actual price is, but I think it might be 50 cents a tag or something. You can have them branded with your name on them. And that way the consumer knows that thermal abuse has not happened in the supply chain. There are a couple of other manufacturers that are making temperature tracking devices with a similar, those are the most affordable ones. The ones that actually have a thermometer and a recording device, those, 25 to 50 to $100 a piece, you're not going to get your restaurant to send those back to you, so you can reuse them. But these VitSab tabs, and the other one is escaping me right now, but can be found on my website or in my newsletter. They are simple and affordable, and do give you the confidence. But the multi-source illness is a huge challenge in our industry, because most people are buying a medley plate now. The restaurants are notoriously bad about keeping records and keeping the tags in order and knowing who ate what. And the consumers are incredibly bad at remembering what they ate when they show up at the hospital. So doing the trace back and pinning it to a single oyster, especially if the customer ate, 3 or 5 oysters that night, the multi-source illness is a huge challenge. Who do you tag the illness with? It's really unfair to just tag everybody with they ate 2 oysters. Well, we'll give you half an illness. Well, if you're the big dog and you're selling more oysters, you're going to get more of those partial illnesses. So this is a big challenge for the ISSC, because actually most Vibrio illnesses now are multi-source, and you cannot tell where they got it.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks. And so with those VitSap tags, is that something that a lot of growers in the East Coast are implementing, or is it still kind of in the early stages there?
I certainly during COVID, when everybody had to move to try and get people to eat oysters at home, and they were shipping out FedEx and UPS boxes to individual growers. Well, FedEx, during that period was overwhelmed with boxes. And so people wouldn't get it in 2 days. And the customers was saying, well, I got my oysters in 3 days. And is it not, I'm sending it back. I'm not paying you for these oysters. Well, it turns out that, are the cold packs still frozen in there? Is the VitSab tab still green? Well, guess what? Those oysters are still safe. You don't have to send them back. Please pay us for your product. It got to be very popular during COVID.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
All right, well, we have Bob's contact here right in front of us. Thank you so much for your time today. That was an absolute wealth of information. And hopefully we can get some folks reaching out to you, as you're certainly the expert in the field. I also want to plug James. He's our new shellfish mariculture specialist. So I'm going to put his email in our chat box as well. So please reach out to him as well. You could certainly reach out to me if you have any questions, and I can point you in the right direction too. We did record this presentation. It's going to be available on the webpage. That's that same event page that you registered at. The link is at the top of the chat box, and we'll put the slides up there as well, so you could download them and easily have this information. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and say thank you, and have a good rest of your Friday and a great weekend.